My mother was born in Quila and my father was born in Amacueca, both rural towns in Jalisco, Mexico. My mother was one of 12 children, my father one of 16. My great-grandfather fought in the Mexican Revolution. I would like to believe that I inherited his fighting spirit. Both my parents were born to extreme poverty. My mother tells us stories of fearing the torrential rains because that meant that her cardboard sandals would wash away. My father worked the pitaya fields with my grandfather so that they could make a living from their fruit stand in the Mercado San Juan de Dios in Guadalajara. My mother started working as a maid for a German woman at the tender age of 7. I go by my middle name Elena, but my first name is Hilda. In Spanish, the H is silent. My name is Nordic German, and it means battle or German war maiden. My mother named me after a woman who helped change the course of her life. Both my parents married very young. My mother was 16 and my father was 21. They lost 3 children in Mexico because they had little to no access to health care. This tragedy motivated my father to seek a better life for his family. He braved the uncertainty of a life in the U.S. and immigrated not knowing the language, with only the clothes on his back and $5 to his name. Like most immigrants, he took whatever job anyone would give him, and he saved until he could send for my mother and my eldest sister, which was the only surviving sibling born in Mexico. Once my parents were reunited in the U.S., they had 5 more kids. I have 5 sisters and 1 brother. My mother worked as a seamstress in a sweatshop in downtown LA, sewing baby clothes. Her boss would let her bring big bags of clothes home so that she could tend to her children. She would get 25 cents for every completed dress. Our job was to sew while she cooked, so I guess that made us child laborers. I helped my mom do the math on all of her completed items and made sure that she always got paid what she was owed. Her boss must have hated this young kid because I would walk into his office with my mom and show him the discrepancies in her paycheck. I started doing the accounting for her co-workers as well and made sure that they got paid for their work. We lived in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment. What little we had in terms of materialistic things, my parents more than made up for with love and support. We lived in a neighborhood where everyone was poor, so we never knew a life outside of that reality. Both my parents were not allowed to go to school because they had to work in order to survive. Both of them taught themselves how to read and write, so you can imagine that they could not help us with our homework. In elementary school, I was lucky to have a teacher by the name of Mr. Chappelle, who inspired his students from this poor inner city school to compete against the most affluent schools in the greater Los Angeles area. This was when I witnessed firsthand the huge disparity in our educational and economic system. Our teacher, however, did not allow us to make excuses or sulk in self-pity. He opened our minds to the possibility that we were just as worthy, just as smart, and capable of conquering our greatest fears through education. We started winning these competitions and our confidence was unshakable. This teacher marked a pivotal moment in my life. Mr. Chappelle subscribed to the Socratic method and would call us to the front of the classroom and spontaneously ask us to recite from memory a poem from Edgar Allan Poe or Rudyard Kipling. This meant that you had to be prepared at all times. He introduced us to Shakespeare, Leo Tolstoy, J.D. Salinger, Richard Wright, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and taught us calculus, geometry, and trigonometry, without letting us know that these are classes we would normally take in high school. He believed in us, and this was all I needed to realize that I could do anything regardless of my socioeconomic status. Because I lived in a poor, gang-infested neighborhood, this meant that I only qualified to go to a public school that would likely not prepare me for college. Our elementary school teacher convinced my parents to send me to a private school. I attended Bishop Connolly High School and was forced to work full-time to pay for my tuition since my parents could not afford it. I had 3 jobs that I would juggle: the ice cream shop, shoe store, and a movie theater. These were all in the same mall. I would rush to scoop ice cream immediately after school, Once the ice cream shop closed, I would work the concession stand at the movie theater and then weekends at the shoe shop. My boss at the movie theater would let me do my homework during downtime. I honestly don't know how I was able to manage that schedule, but looking back now, I know I did this because I knew that it would get me out of being a statistic. Most of my neighborhood friends were either affiliated with gangs, did drugs, got pregnant early, or would die very young from gang violence. I was terrified of becoming that. During my senior year, I got the crazy idea of applying to Cornell University. I honestly thought that Cornell was in New York City, and I was drawn by the idea of the Big Apple. Little did I know that Cornell was 4 hours away from the city, almost bordering Canada, with some of the harshest winters I have ever experienced in my life. I applied early decision thinking that there was no way I would get into an Ivy League school. I got my acceptance letter in December, and in March I got my acceptance letters to USC, UCLA, Berkeley, which was my top choice. You would think that I would be celebrating, but going to New York was never in my agenda. When you apply early decision, you sign a contract stating that you will attend that university if you get accepted. I was devastated. I had no idea how to break the news to my parents. No one in my family had ever gone to college, and no one was allowed to move out unless you were married or kicked out because of a pregnancy. Prior to leaving to Cornell, I had never boarded a plane in my life. I also had no clue what to expect once I landed. I was in culture shock. I was a city girl, and suddenly I was transported to farmlands, waterfalls, and gorges. I cried for days after arriving, and I called my parents to tell them that I had made a mistake and I wanted to come home. My mom told me that I was not allowed to come back home until I finished. She was very firm. She told me in Spanish, "Te fuiste de la casa, pues ahora te chingas y no regreses hasta que termines." It basically translates to, you moved out of the house, now you're screwed, and you better not come back until you're done. Tough love, I know, but that was my mom back then. She knew that if she coddled me, I would give up. At Cornell, I stood out like a sore thumb. I was happy when I met other fellow Latino students, but was quickly slapped back to reality when I would find out the enormous amount of wealth that many of these students from Argentina, Peru, Chile, Colombia, Puerto Ricans from the island possessed. I was so naive and I did not fit in. Our backgrounds were so different, and the more I tried to assimilate, the brighter my truths became. My roommates were from Ireland, Russia, Vietnam, and Peru. We all had one thing in common. We were poor as hell, and we found that collectively we could afford an apartment at the bottom of the hill. If you're from Cornell, you know what that meant. The bottom of the hill is akin to saying that you're the runt of the litter. No one in their right mind would live at the bottom of the hill, because this meant that climbing that hill in the winter every day would be a feat in endurance. The scenery was beautiful, but having snow for 5 to 6 months out of the year wears on your soul. The suicide rate at Cornell was very high, and my goal was not to become that statistic. So I stood in my comfort zone. I occupied myself with work and school. I landed a job at a neurobiology lab doing DNA sequencing to understand the neural circuit of the spiny lobster. I'm sure that at this point you are thinking, this girl is a total nerd. I'm not, I promise. This job was serendipity at its finest. I was working at a cafeteria, washing pots and pans. My hands were raw and pruned from the enormous amount of dishes I had to wash. One day I happened to run into a neurobiology lab during a snowstorm for warmth, and I was drawn to the white coats, the beakers, the goggles, and pipelles. I didn't know how I mustered the courage to walk into the lab and ask if they needed help, not realizing I was speaking to the professor himself. He must have seen the desperation in my eyes and took pity on my pathetic self. He said that his lab was for graduate students with NIH grants, but maybe he could find a project for me, and maybe, just maybe, I could apply for a grant also. This was another pivotal moment in my life. I got the grant. I became one of his hardest working students, working late hours doing DNA sequencing, extracting data that we had not been able to obtain before. I learned how to write papers, We published our research in the Journal of Neuroscience, and I was introduced to this whole new world behind the scenes of new and innovative discoveries. Needless to say, I was able to move to the top of the hill, and I brought my roommates with me. I graduated with a dual degree in microbiology and Spanish literature. I always knew I wanted to be a doctor, but when it came time for me to apply to medical school, the college counselor said that I was not cut out for the science. This crushed me. She judged me based on my grades and said that I was better suited for the arts. I was a B+, A- student in microbiology, and I had a 4.0 in Spanish. I was devastated, and I let this woman convince me that I would not make it. I took a year off determined to kick ass on my MCAT so that it would make up for my B+ average. I was so wrong. When I finally applied to medical school and got interviews at all of my top schools, I was asked why I didn't apply the year before. I told them the honest truth, and they just laughed and said, you would have been accepted right out of college. I tell you this because if there's anything that you take home today, is that no one should dictate what you can and cannot do with your life. I was lucky enough to be accepted to UCLA Medical School. This meant I could come back home. Medical school was no joke, but I built a strong network. My fellow classmates were so amazing, and we leaned on each other to get through the curriculum and the long hours. During my clinical rotations, I chose to spend 3 months in Mexico, very close to the mercado where my father and grandfather had their fruit stand. I would walk past the mercado on my way to the Hospital Civil Nuevo in Guadalajara, and I know that if my grandfather were alive, he would be so proud. In Mexico, if you're a warm body and you're a medical student, you get thrown into the lion's den. I was delivering babies, performing C-sections and hysterectomies without having my medical degree. It was the most exhilarating experience of my life, and I came back determined to be an OBGYN. Once I figured out my life's calling, the rest is history. I was accepted to an OBGYN residency program at Harbor UCLA. I did a fellowship at Stanford University for minimally invasive and robotic surgery. And then I dabbled in several jobs before I realized that what I wanted most in my life was to open my own practice, which is both the most amazing and terrifying choice. Amazing because I could design and dictate exactly how I want my patients to experience their healthcare with me, and terrifying because no one teaches you anything about how to run a business in medical school. My goal today is to help you get there. The first thing you have to do if you're even thinking about becoming a doctor is to take a long look in the mirror and ask yourself if you're ready to commit to lifelong learning, to self-sacrifice, to putting your life on hold for marriage and children, to long hours, to extreme criticism from harsh professors, to losing lives and being able to deal with that emotionally and giving 1,000% in pursuit of your passion. Never, ever become a doctor for money, prestige, or parental pressure. If this is your goal, you need to rethink your strategy because you will either fail or succeed and be miserable. Be a doctor because you have a driving force that makes you want to help people. Be a doctor because healing someone gives you an incredible sense of self-worth and more satisfaction than any paycheck. Be a doctor because you will not hesitate when called upon to help in the most inopportune moments. A car crash, someone having a heart attack in flight, someone choking in a restaurant, someone drowning or delivering a baby in a car, a pandemic. Be a doctor because you can volunteer in third world countries and make a huge difference. Your services are needed everywhere, and no robot or computer can ever replace you. So now that you've decided that you want to pursue this career, congratulations, you've picked one of the most noble professions I know. But how do you get here? Here are some words of advice. Number 1, do not ever slack off. Kick butt in high school so that you get into a reputable university. Number 2, you will need a bachelor's degree, so you have to go to college. This is typically 4 years. In college, major in something that you love, but you must complete the medical school requirements, which typically are 1 year of biology, 1 year of chemistry, 1 year of physics, math, either statistics or calculus, English, biochem, psychology, and sociology. Each medical school has their own requirements, so you should definitely take a look and see what they want from you. You will also have to take your MCAT and do well in all your courses. Number 3, you then apply to medical school, and this is another 4 years of your life. If you want to practice in the US, going to a US medical school is your best option. You can go to allopathic medical school, which is where you get your medical degree or MD, or you can go to osteopathic where you get your DO. Sometimes students apply to medical school in the Caribbean or abroad because getting into med school in the US is hard as hell. Regardless of where you go to medical school, if you want to practice in the US, you have to complete a US residency program. In med school, you take an exam called Step 1 and you complete clerkships in all specialties. Be sure to shine in those clerkships that you are strongly considering for your life career. Number 4, in medical school, you will apply to a residency program, which can be another 3 to 7 years. Getting into residency is governed by the match, which is the National Resident Matching Program, which means that you rank the programs that you like and have been offered an interview, and then they rank you. This is placed into an algorithm, and on match day, you get an envelope telling you where you will be doing your residency. Residency is a test of endurance. It doesn't focus so much on test taking, but on lives of people that are now in your care. The hours are long and irregular, and the pressure can sometimes be very intense, but the rewards are extremely gratifying because you're a doctor now, and everything you have learned so far, you're finally putting into practice. Once you're done with residency, you can either start working in private practice or work for a hospital, or you can choose to apply to a fellowship program. Fellowship programs are meant to immerse you in a subspecialty. For example, an OBGYN can apply for fellowship in urogynecology, perinatology, reproductive endocrinology, oncology, or minimally invasive or robotic surgery. Similarly, orthopedic surgeons, for example, can complete fellowships in sports injuries, spine, hand, pediatrics, trauma, hip or knee replacements. General surgeons have fellowships in vascular, colorectal, breast, cardiac, transplants, pediatrics. These fellowships can be another 1 to 5 years, but they really help you to stand out compared to another physician who's never completed fellowship training. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that by the time you're done with your training, you will either be anywhere from 29 to 40 years of age. In other countries, most students complete 4 years of high school and then 6 years of medical school track. They basically skip college altogether. I was lucky enough to be on the admissions committee for UCLA Medical School. When I interviewed candidates for medical school, the universal answer for why they wanted to be doctors was to help people. But so do nurses, pharmacists, massage therapists, social workers, so your reasons need to be a little bit more profound. As a doctor, you are the leader of the healthcare team, and the accountability falls on you. You cannot make mistakes like a plumber or a mechanic without there being dire consequences sometimes. Sometimes these mistakes are out of your hands, but regardless, it weighs on your soul. So you have to have that fighting spirit in you if you want to succeed as a doctor. It has been 16 years since I graduated from my residency program, 8 years since I opened my own practice, and not a single day goes by where I don't wake up feeling fulfilled. I honestly don't feel like I'm coming to work. When you do what you love, it isn't work, it's much more than that. I have 14 employees and 15,000 active patients. I stopped delivering babies 3 years ago, and now my practice is gynecology focused, with a strong emphasis on surgery and optimizing health through hormone replacement therapy. Surgery, however, is my true passion. I could live in the operating room. I have tackled some of the toughest cases with an enormous sense of satisfaction, and I'm also grateful to have the insight to know when a case is beyond my abilities. I have no problems letting go of that ego if it means that collaborating with my amazing colleagues will give my patients the best possible outcome. My side projects are providing useful information for patients via Instagram, YouTube, and through my podcast, Vagenius. Yes, I know, the name is very clever. I still make time for my creative side. Many of you may not know this, but I make jewelry. That's my little side hustle, and it's my way of decompressing. I love to travel, and I love exercising. I have patients that come from all over the world, Europe and South America. I built my practice from scratch with my own money and a strong resolve. My dream is to eventually open a women's wellness center. I don't know when that's going to happen, but one thing that I've learned is that you never stop yearning for bigger and greater things. Being a trailblazer is the mentality I hope to inspire in you. Challenge yourself and don't be afraid of failures. They build character.